The automation journey is large, and one of the key components that everyone thinks of right away is process automation, but there are lots of other fantastic technologies around document automation, data automation, there's RPA, digital signatures, so many things that you can think about. And today, we're really excited to have you to talk about productivity monitoring. How do you monitor the people behind all of the automation, especially when everyone is working remotely these days? So I'm thrilled to have our partner Netsurit here with us. And without further delay, I'll introduce you to Louis de Klerk. He's the CIO for our partner Netsurit. He has put together a really interesting agenda for you today, and we'll talk through the Netsurit productivity monitor that he has personally been involved in creating. And I think you will really enjoy the session today. So over to you, Louis.
Good morning, everyone. So yeah, I'm Louis de Klerk. I'm the CIO of Netsurit. And pretty much since last year, February, March, I've been hard at work on the Netsurit Productivity Monitor, or NPM. And during this time, we've learned a lot about monitoring people for productivity. And we've learned a lot of things that's great to do, and we've also learned a number of things that should be avoided. And what I'd like to share with you this morning are some of those insights and some of the research that we've done, and also some of the research that we found other people have done. So my background is, I refer to myself as a rehabilitated developer. I've got a long, strong background in software development, but I'm also involved in company strategy, and being a CIO, I'm involved in all aspects of not just our business, but I'm also very often consulting to other companies on a variety of things, from software architecture, but also regarding business strategy, etc. And so my perspective is typically, I typically look at the details of something. And so a lot of the information I'll be sharing with you today is rather detailed oriented, not necessarily technical, but how do one really monitor for productivity and what's really important there. And so with that, I'd like to introduce you to, well, not just our tool, but the general concept of monitoring for productivity. And so many people have asked over time, what's the most important thing for every business? And I'm sure a number of people will give different answers to this question. But an answer that regularly comes up is that your workforce, an effective and productive workforce, is probably one of the biggest key components to a successful business. And it's especially that productive keyword that people would like to address. We all want to have a more productive workforce because, very often that results in a healthier company and more profits, and that's a good thing. But as people try to improve productivity, we all find out that that's really hard in many cases. And it's due to the complexity and the variability of what makes people productive. There's different people with different roles, different characters, different tasks that they need to perform. And to monitor the output of those tasks can be very difficult. But also there's a number of things that you don't quite know is happening, a number of hidden factors. And so what influence productivity? That's a long list of things. I've highlighted here the most common things, like a person's skills, their character, the incentives that they get. And typically, these are the things that you look at when you recruit someone. Of course, most companies focus on the tools and processes that we provide our workers with. And that's very often a correct place to start. But it's also much harder to change. It's the work environment and then some of these hidden factors that are very often unobserved. And it turns out that maybe not all of productivity, but a large part of someone's or a company's productivity can be unlocked by getting better insights into this work environment and some of these other hidden factors. What we've also seen is that now in the age of COVID-19, a number of changes have occurred here, which can negatively impact productivity. And it's these hidden factors, and there are so many of them, from stress to distractions, burnout, lack of rest, inefficient tools, skills mismatch. Like I said, that there are many of these different factors. And because that's harder to observe, it means that when you join an online meeting, not unlike this one, you might see a pretty picture in terms of how people work and so on, but the reality can sometimes be quite different. And because this reality is very often hidden from us, that makes things much harder to deal with. So stress is one of the big components, one of those hidden factors that are hard to observe, but that can make a big difference. And so if we ask ourselves what causes stress, again, it's a very complex topic, workplace stress. And there's a number of causes for this. The top causes are things like work pressure, poor communication with management, not enough rest, the lack of incentive, which typically boils down to salary and wages, unfair treatment, and a lack of support or appreciation for managers. And of course, there's a number of things one can do to address this. And we'll unpack some of these items as we go along. The effects of that stress is where we get worried, because that can be things like high staff turnover, which obviously have a bad effect on almost any company. A long hours work culture, higher medical costs, low productivity, and of course, this is the area that we'll be focusing on. And of course, if all of these other things goes wrong, you'll end up with a higher management overhead from an HR perspective and other aspects of your business, and sick leave, or sometimes people taking no leave, which also has long-term side effects. Now, these stress things have been very well researched in terms of what causes this. And over the last couple of years, and I've cited some of my sources here, and these are, as you see, these are actual medical journals. And for example, the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, these are very well-founded sources. They tell us that the biggest reasons why we see an increase in stress are things like, especially now in the COVID timeframe that we live in, when you have work from home workers, the lack of physical and temporal work boundaries. So what that translates into is, you know, in the past, people used to drive to work and drive back home. And that kind of created a sense of, this is the end of this time period. Now I'm going home and now I can rest. But because those boundaries are no longer there, that resulted in longer work hours, fragmented focus time. And those are the two big contributing factors. But that leads to stress, burnout, and fatigue. And by the way, this is true not just in the developed countries, but also in the developing countries. In fact, this is becoming more and more a thing in developing countries. And a lot of information workers, and so by the way, that's the target area that we focus on, is information workers. More about that later, are affected. Now, companies would like to mitigate some of these things. And so there's a number of interventions or ways of solving this problem. They were more effective when they included changes to management styles, physical exercises, and then taking breaks and ensuring that people have adequate time to do their working. And the idea here is to reduce things like stress and fatigue. And of course, fatigue in the workplace is typically associated with shift work, long work hours, and sleep impairment. Now, the financial effects of stress is also very scary. In the US, a study was done, and they actually found that about 1 million people are absent every day due to stress. And that costs companies an average of about $600 per person that they employ, not just the people that are sick, but you know, it ends up being a huge cost. Even back in 2014, the British economy figured that they lost about 14.3 billion, and that's in private industry due to work-related stress. What I found pretty interesting is that even healthcare costs are about 46% higher for stressed out workers. It turns out that stress is the second biggest contributor to healthcare costs. In fact, it has a higher impact on healthcare costs than diabetes and smoking combined. So stress is one of those things that we don't often talk about, but it has a huge impact on this. And so from a company point of view, things like attrition, that is the result of that stress. Obviously, there are a variety of costs that attrition could lead to. Sick leave add costs to your business. Again, there's a number of different factors here. Overtime also costs your business financially. And then there are, of course, the things that you can't easily measure. Things like burnout, which causes people to disengage and be less productive. Bad habits that forms, long work hour culture, people that fake sick leave. And eventually you end up with a toxic culture. where people don't trust each other because they can't see what each other are doing. You know, managers used to be able to walk into the office and see how people are productive, but they could also pick up on the subtle cues when people are tired or frustrated. And because they no longer see those things, people make assumptions about what other people are doing. Some people, of course, do amazing work. Unfortunately, not everyone does. And of course, that lack of visibility means that we can no longer intervene and assist people and help people get out of potentially bad habits. And eventually that leads to a lack of empathy. And over time, that can really create a toxic culture at the workplace. Now, of course, in terms of trying to fix this, many management books will tell you, if you need to fix something, you measure something, then you identify ways in which you can fix that, and you try to change people's behavior. Hopefully, in time, changing some habits. You can even then, over time, as you know what you're doing, change policy, etc. But it all starts with what you measure. And of course, choosing what you measure is extremely important. And then making sure that the quality of the data that you measure is adequately enough so that you can actually affect the change. And this is, of course, what our product and the general sense of monitoring for productivity should focus on. Of course, we can all focus on the business aspect of this, and sure, we'll talk about that aspect quite a bit this morning. But you also need to consider the impact that this might have on your culture, some of the laws that you need to comply with. And again, globally, there are so many different things from a legal perspective to consider. And then, of course, we also should consider the ethics of what we do. And what I'd like to do this morning is to talk about all 4 of these aspects as we go through the things that one should monitor for productivity. Now, there are so many different types of people and roles out there. But just for clarity, this morning, we're going to focus on information or knowledge workers. So that typically people working on computers as the primary type of job or work that they do. And of course, as I take it you all know, being on a Zoom call this Monday morning, almost every industry out there has a fair percentage of knowledge workers. For some companies, it's as low as 25%. And of course, for these types of industries, and I'm sure there's many more, some of those percentages can get quite high. In fact, for many companies, it's much higher, up to 90% of their staff are information workers. And because this is typically for some companies, the bulk of their productive workforce, what can we do to monitor and help to improve how they are productive? So let's delve in a little bit deeper and look at some of the details. And so firstly, I'd like to talk about the concept of a leading indicator and a lagging indicator. Now, maybe before we talk in detail about this slide, consider, for example, getting on a scale early in the morning to have a look at how much you weigh. By the time you get on that scale and you see how many kilograms you're weighing, by then it's too late to change the answer. It's a lagging indicator. It's measuring something after the fact. If you want to change that, it doesn't help you get angry at the scale. You need to look at the early inputs, things like how much food did you take? What kind of calories were they? How much exercise did you have? And there's a number of these leading indicators, which is relatively simple to change if you're disciplined enough and if you actually monitor how much exercise and food and so on you take. And it's these leading indicators by changing these leading indicators that you can essentially affect what the lagging indicator shows you. So in terms of productivity, we find that there are a number of leading indicators like the lack of support, skills mismatch. Sometimes we give people jobs that is too easy for them and they get bored. Very often the task we give them is too difficult and they get frustrated. But then there are other things like back-to-back meetings that can be very disruptive. And I'll explain a little bit more about that later. Insufficient breaks, people being distracted during meetings, very often regular after-hour work or regular weekend work. People don't always have sufficient time to focus on something. And of course, as we all know, and this is well documented, social media can also have a very detrimental effect on this. In time, though, this all produces low productivity and even lower quality of work. And given more time, that very often results in untaken leave, people getting disengaged, They developed issues with compensation or their wages and taking sick leave. And by the time it's too late, you see the resignation. Now, if we look at these things, these first couple are mostly invisible. They're hidden. And it's typically only the individual that sees them and that are worried about these things. Teams, they typically see, and this is a little bit more visible, they see the low productivity and low quality of work, although that can also be difficult to monitor and to observe. And it's typically HR that sees these things. And this is typically fairly visible, or at least to HR. And of course, when somebody leaves, that's highly visible to the organization. What's interesting here is that very often HR and the team are in different silos. They don't talk to each other on a daily basis, especially not concerning these things. But neither the team nor HR typically have visibility about what concerns the individual. Very few people in the team or in HR actually sees any of these things. And that can create a problem. Let's look at it from a different angle, which I refer to as the hidden inputs of productivity. You know, there are some visible inputs that we provide, then there are some things we don't see, and that produces the output, the productivity. Of course, there's also some hidden outputs. So practically, what does this mean? It means that, you know, the tasks that we give someone, you know, visible inputs, tasks, the time we give people to perform those tasks, the resources we provide them, the tools, typically applications and websites and whatever else, and the processes, those are all highly visible. And of course, the team sees these things. The team then also looks at the output, and this outcome is very diverse, very unique to the tasks that people produces. It's these hidden inputs that are very often, you know, not observed. Things like a person's personality or character, their skills, incentives. Well, HR sees those things, and HR typically looks at these things when you recruit someone. Now, sadly, very often we don't revisit these areas, or at least if we revisit them on an annual basis. But it's very important to keep your eye on these things and might try to develop some of those things, like develop skills, even personality, although that's much harder. The support that a person gets from their team, sure, somewhat visible, maybe to one or two people in the team, but mostly the support and feedback someone gets is very important in terms of their productivity, but not often very observed. It's the distractions, whether people have sufficient time to focus and whether they have sufficient rests, that's typically only visible to the individual. And it turns out that these things have a huge impact on the eventual outcome. And it's these items like distractions, for example, if you use non-business applications during office hours, that might distract you from your day job. Emails being sent during meetings or meetings itself, social media during meetings. There's a whole way in which a number of these different things can end up distracting someone. We'll talk quite a bit about flow a little bit later on. And of course, rest. Do people take enough breaks or too many breaks? After hours work, sure, a little is fine, but the moment that becomes a pattern and it becomes a lot of after hours work or weekend work, that can really demotivate people and back-to-back meetings. So if we look at all of these productivity influencers, and you know, I've just grouped them into these broad categories. These are the items that we feel are the leading indicators. That's the places where you can make short-term changes, you know, and see effects quick so that you can avoid some of the lagging indicators, some of the long-term side effects. So let's take the first one here, things like regular breaks. So in this little diagram there, let's assume the blue is, you know, typical work that people do in business applications that your company uses, and pink is the breaks that people take. Now, in most countries, there's a law that says people need to break this often. Now, the laws vary from country to country. In the US and the UK, for example, they require that you rest for at least 20 minutes per 8-hour shift. Now, in other countries, it's a bit different. But a lot of studies have been done around information workers. And for information workers, computer users, if you like, the scientific ideal is that you work for 52 minutes and then take a 17-minute break. Now, that's a little bit hard to get your head around because it's not even numbers. And so the scientific community agrees that the practical idea is to work for 60 minutes and then break for 15. Now, that's the ideal. Obviously, nobody works in such a robotic way that we always do this. But if we now look at someone's real behavior, which you can get if you monitor for this thing, we can see that this person probably takes too many breaks, 85 minutes, 20 minutes, and so this person is taking too many breaks, and maybe this person is taking too few breaks. But how do you monitor for this, and how do you pick up those problems? And of course, this is just during a workday. There are other types of rest. For example, the law requires that you should have at least 1 day a week without any work. So for example, a Friday or a Saturday or a Sunday in which the person ideally should not do any work. And again, this is well backed up in the medical science as well. Let's talk about some other things like meetings. And so the practical idea from a scientific basis is that you should have 1 to 4 meetings per day, where each meeting is shorter than 90 minutes each. Well, that's the ideal. But if we consider, for example, this example, where this person has many meetings, those are the green boxes, that could be too many meetings. Now, 1 day with too many meetings is fine, but if this becomes a pattern where it's every day, or at least the majority of your days, that can become a problem. Another problem that can happen is too many back-to-back meetings. If you go into one meeting and right thereafter, without any break, you go into a different meeting about a different topic, the brain takes a lot of energy to context switch, to change your way of thinking into the new topic. And if you do that once, that's fine. But if you do so time and time again, it turns out that is quite stressful for most people and can actually, in the end, result in fatigue and a lot of stress. And the idea is that, to pick up when this is becoming a trend and then advise people to, maybe book a bit of a break between meetings or not schedule meetings in such a fashion. Of course, then there's another aspect where people can become distracted during meetings. And I'm sure we've all seen this, and I myself, I'm guilty of this more often than I'd like to admit, where people send emails or open up other applications in the middle of a meeting so that they can focus on different things. But the result is that they're not focusing on that meeting. Very often they miss tasks assigned to them, or they miss important details of that meeting. And eventually that ends up adding quite a bit of stress as well. Now, a little bit of distraction is probably not a problem, but when those distraction levels becomes problematic, that's something that management might want to know about. Of course, meeting efficiency is then therefore quite important. And so the cost of meetings, if you can have meetings that lasts 2 hours, let's say 8 people attend that costs you 16 man hours. So if you ask management today, which are the most expensive meetings from a man-hour perspective, it would take quite a bit of an exercise to just find out in the last month which expensive meetings did we have. And of course, if we then ask, how distracted were people during those meetings? So we spent all this effort to have this meeting, but if 40% of the people were highly distracted during that meeting, was that investment in terms of man hours really worth it? And so it's really hard to identify expensive meetings, large meetings, long meetings. And the idea is, if you can identify those things, then you can start to advise people, well, that meeting you had there, or this meeting, maybe try to have it shorter, or have fewer people attend, only have the people that's really necessary in the meeting present, etc. We find that especially recurring meetings, we have these recurring meetings that happens every week. And, in hindsight, you think, well, this could have been an email. And those are the kinds of meetings that if you can identify them, you can proactively work to try to avoid some of those unnecessary things. The next thing I'd like to talk about is flow states. Now, flow states is a very exciting field of research, but let's simplify that term, although you'll see that I refer to flow states for the rest of the presentation. But think of this as undivided focus, where people can really zone in. I'm sure some of you have already experienced the flow state, where you go into this hyper-focus state you're in the zone, you're super productive, you're focused on just one thing, and everything just seems as if it's going your way. Turns out that flow states is great for productivity, but there's a few things to know about this. Firstly, it takes about 30 minutes of being busy with something before you enter the flow state. And then the flow state can last up to another 60 minutes. But of course, if somebody disrupts you while you're in your flow state, it'll take you another 30 minutes to get in that flow state again. And so it's really important that people have the opportunity to get into these flow states so that they can be more productive. Of course, this depends on role by role, right? A developer, for example, for a developer, it's really important to be able to focus and really work through the complexity of what they're busy creating. For other people, like a salesperson, they might multitask more. They might want to do lots of things at a time. And for their role, flow states may be less important. Now, of course, there are things that can inhibit flow states, stop you from entering flow states, like too many meetings, too many breaks, too many tasks to be done at the same time, or just not enough time available to even get into a flow state in order to be productive. So if we look at, and this looks a bit overwhelming, but if we look at a couple of examples here, and we say that blue is when people actively work in business applications, and all these other things are essentially distractions, things that stop your flow state. If we look at this example, we can easily see that this first example, there was no work for more than let's say between 60 and 120 minutes. This person, the second one, there's a 90-minute potential flow state. Again, all we know is that the person worked without distraction. And so the chances that the person was able to really have undivided focus time in this area here is pretty good. There we have another one. This second one, the person didn't really have flow states. This guy did really well, 100 minutes, 70 minutes, 95 minutes. And so at least 4 flow states there. Some of these other people just didn't have any flow states. Now, again, depending on the person's role, that could be important or not. But ask yourself, how easy is it to identify these things? The moment I show a diagram like this to people, they're immediately, they wonder, how can I get this level of insight into what my people are doing? Now, by the way, we actually experimented by providing people with this view. It turns out that it's a lot of work to look at this data and manually interpret this. And so, by the way, you might want this view, but you really don't. You want something else, like a productivity monitoring tool, to have this kind of information and then to extract for you what is really important. Okay, and that, I suppose, is a good introduction into our product, the Netsurit Productivity Monitor, because it's with these insights and goals that we set out. And let me show you what we have developed. So the Netsurit Productivity Monitor is a tool that we've developed. It's a software as a service product from ourselves, from Netsurit, which of course we provide for resale through partners in the Middle East, for example, like InobitsME. The idea is that it should provide improved visibility and insight into people's computer activity and the work pattern of individuals. So I just quickly want to pause there. NPM is software and it monitors what people do on their computers, but we can only see what people do on their computers. And that means that, despite everything I've spoken about, it is really important when we look at the results of these reports to know that we can only see what's happening on the computers. We do not know about things like an incoming phone call or an impromptu meeting that somebody had, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's really important to note. Also important to note is that not everyone's role, not everyone's job is always on a computer. Many people have jobs where they need to drive out to somewhere to visit a customer or to visit a site, etc. And there are a number of these things to which we are completely blind, which means that NPM is really an ideal tool for people who mostly work on computers. And of course, there's a number of people that does that. But it's not necessarily a silver bullet or a perfect solution for every role out there. Of course, the moment we say we monitor people, man, it's really important that the software is ethical in that it does not infringe on someone's privacy. And we'll talk quite a bit about this in the upcoming slides, about what to think about, what to do, and what not to do. Our software makes it very easy then to identify these organizational work patterns, as previously discussed, and obviously we'll talk about that some more, so that we can identify people at the risk of burning out. And of course, potentially improving people's work habits so that they can become more productive. So if we go back to this slide here in the beginning, NPM really provides us with insight into these things: back-to-back meetings, insufficient breaks, people being distracted during meetings, after hours work, weekend work, insufficient focus time, social media, etc. In fact, it can even tell us how often someone has a one-on-one meeting with their line manager. Now, a line manager meeting doesn't necessarily mean that they're getting support, but at least it's some indication that there is a good relationship between the person and their line manager. And that can be a pretty interesting leading indicator as well. If we look at this view, NPM in its first edition, which has been on the market now for just over a year, in our first version, we focused on seeing when people work and what tools they use. In our second version, we've added to this now this ability to have extra insight into distractions, specifically looking at these things. And it is our belief that if you've got a smart team or a smart company that would like to improve productivity, it is by having insights into these areas that NPM can help you to improve productivity. But you are right, we do not monitor things like personality or skills. I mean, we don't do skills assessments. There's a number of things we don't try to go into. And it's because those things would differ so much from company to company that it would be impossible to make a generic tool that can do all of this. Also, interesting to note is we don't try to measure the outcome. And we found that there are so many different jobs, so many different companies, that to try to create a software tool to monitor the outcome, man, it's almost impossible. And if you try to do that, would put such a large burden on the organization in terms of timesheets and this form to fill in and that form to fill in, that eventually you end up eroding, you're taking away from productivity rather than increasing it. So what does NPM do? Well, it's a busy slide, but let me just go through this in some detail. Firstly, we collect data. We've got two ways of doing that. We've got an NPM agent. That's some software that you install on people's Windows devices that essentially monitors which applications is the person actively focusing on right now. And is the person busy? So we ask Windows whether there has been any mouse or keyboard activity. We don't actually record what the mouse or keyboard activity was, but Windows just tells us, yes, this person is actively busy. We also then have the NPM engine, which retrieves data from Office 365 to just highlight detail about your meetings and emails. So who is attending the email and when did it occur? But we do not get things like the contents of the meeting or the contents of the email or any attachments or anything like that. We then process this data, most notably, when you sign up for NPM, and you can always go and amend or further configure this data, you need to tell NPM, these are my business applications, whether it's a desktop application or a website. And NPM only monitors those things. NPM will never monitor any other application. So if somebody goes to a recruitment site or a gaming website or whatever other website that there might be, NPM will pick up that so many hours during office hours was spent on a non-business application, but it will not record what application or website that was or what the person was doing there, not at all. We then analyze the trends that we get from that, as you've seen some of the screenshots and the diagrams that I've shown, and we then analyze work behavior for optimal productivity and health, things like flow states, focus time, etc., etc. We then store this data. We only keep data for up to 6 months. Every customer's data is stored in its own private store. And the output of this is then weekly or monthly emails. And so you can configure the system, for example, to send an email to the actual people being monitored or their line managers, whether the line manager is monitored or not, or even a departmental report where you can kind of essentially summarize everyone in your department. Now, these are just summarized findings. We then also have a really interesting Power BI report that allows you to deeply explore the results of what we found. And so as an example, we've got a whole, it's one Power BI file, which you can then publish in your own Power BI environment, where you can analyze a number of things. And so here's one of those Power BI screens where I can easily see, well, right now I'm monitoring 71 users, and the number of users I've chosen to monitor went up and down, et cetera, et cetera. But I can easily see that there are some people with potential rest problems. So in terms of daily breaks, this week, and the week is not yet finished, but this week we have 18 people that probably have some issues with daily breaks, which is less than the previous week or the week before that. And of course, this month, 17 people versus the previous month's 30 and the previous month's 55. And so we kind of easily see how many people might have problems. And if I want to look at more details, I can click here. I can see how many people are struggling with flow states. From this screenshot, it looks like we used to be fairly good with this, but something happened and people just don't get time to focus anymore. We can see things like one-on-one meetings with line managers, and there's a whole range of metrics around meetings, like expensive meeting disruption percentage or high meeting distraction, et cetera, et cetera. I can also easily see when people are more productive in terms of when in the week, how often, how much time do people spend in business applications per week, per day, or when in the day. And so here we see the 24 hours of the day. And we see that about 6, 7 o'clock people start working, and then it slowly tapers off here at the end of the day, and some people working into the night. Of course, I can also see a list of people and easily see here things like, for example, how many hours this month, whatever month you selected, how many hours in total were these people actually spending in business applications? Of course, you can sort this the other way around as well and see who has spent the fewest number of hours in those applications. And we can monitor things like business applications, social media use during business hours, et cetera, et cetera. So let's, for example, click here on the explore details for rest. And so here we get a very simple, easy to understand view where I can again see the number of users. I can kind of see in terms of the average numbers of breaks per day, the break duration, the longest break duration, average downtime after hours, do people have actually spent time without any computer activity? And so here we can see some trends. And if I were to look at everyone, I would see everyone's statistics regarding breaks. But in this case, I've said only show me the people that the system has identified as potentially not having enough business hour breaks by duration. And so here we can see that these people in total for the day stands on an average of just over half an hour or just under an hour in terms of total break time for the day. And from a scientific perspective, knowledge worker based, that's probably not enough. But instead of having to look at 100 people and trying to find where the problems are, I can kind of tell, I'd like to look at this problem or that problem, and then easily have the system tell me these are the people with potential issues. Now, if I really wanted to, I could focus in on a specific user, and I can then look at their daily averages. And again, there's a number of metrics to look at here, or their totals for the month. And again, a number of different metrics there. For this person, I can see how many hours they typically spend in business applications during which day of the week. And I can even look at this on a per day basis. And even see which hours of the day that is. Now, if I clicked on one of these days, then it would show me just what happened on that specific day. And of course, I can then see which desktop applications they used, how many hours did they spend on that on average or in total for the month, and even which websites they visited during that time. Now, on the websites, we only show you the DNS name of the website, so the www.something.com. We don't show you the full URL. There's no screenshots. There's no detail about that. And again, only the applications that you've identified as business applications. You may want to compare people that has the same role. And so one of the things we do is we can pick up your job title from Active Directory and then allow you to zoom in on a specific job title so that you can compare people which should actually do the same things because they've got the same job. And being able to see here where people have different behaviors may allow you to kind of start asking questions. Why is this person behaving one way and another person behaving very different from the rest of the team. It's also pretty easy to observe trends overall. And so, for example, here we look at social media in business hours, and we can see here we've clicked on a specific user and see that sometimes they spend more than the company average, sometimes less. And yeah, it's kind of a trend. It doesn't happen just one day in a month. It happens almost every day that this person spends quite a bit of time on social media during business hours. Okay, so let's change direction a little bit. Let's ask about how does this work? Well, we have an agent that we install on someone's Windows computer, and that collects data about which application the person is focusing on, and it sends that to our NPM engine. This NPM engine is configured using our central NPM website, which we use for marketing and sales and configuration, but it doesn't carry any of your data other than the list of users that you want to monitor. This NPM engine then also connects to Office 365, specifically the Graph API and Azure Active Directory, to import a number of different things. We'll talk about what exactly it imports just now. And of course, once the data is stored here, you can then look at that Power BI report. So you can have report viewers, or we can send out emails to the monitored individuals, line managers, and department heads. Some of you might have some questions around this agent. Some detail about that. We've written it in C#, etc., etc. It works online and offline. It collects information every 5 seconds, and every 10 minutes, it uploads that to the NPM server if it's connected. If not, it caches the data and uploads it later on. We only support Windows 8 or 10, and of course, you need PowerShell on there as well. Note that currently we do not support Apple Mac OS, although that's something we'd hope to add somewhere later this year. The agent is very lightweight. It doesn't really use any CPU. It uses very little memory, not a lot of disk space, and it consumes roughly 55 kilobytes of network traffic per hour. To install this, you don't need any admin privileges. And of course, we supply this agent as an MSI package, and you can deploy this using a number of different tools that you may already have. Here we see the agent is running in this person's system toolbar, although you can turn that off so that it doesn't show up. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more from a privacy perspective. NPM does not capture screenshots. It doesn't do keyboard logging, location tracking. It doesn't collect personal information. We'll talk about what personal information it does collect, but nothing serious. So no medical information or anything like that. And it never captures any private application or website details, only the applications that you've indicated is a business application. What do we capture? This is the only detail we capture: someone's login name, their email address, job title, department, and line manager. We get that from Azure AD, from the customer's Azure AD. Now, by the way, this is pretty much what you would see on a business card. So if you consider a business card as an information leak, well, then, yeah. But there's no other sensitive details about the person there. From Office 365, we get the date, time, and the participants of meetings or the recipients of emails, but we do not take the contents of the email or the attachments or any other details from there. And of course, from the agent, we see how much time you've spent in which business applications and websites. And that's essentially what NPM does. But now, having spoken about customers about this over the last year, there are a number of other things to be aware about. And so let's just briefly talk about some of those things. And the first thing, of course, is legal requirements. Now, this is not a legal course or a legal webinar, but be aware that there's a variety of legislations that says what personal information can you collect, and if you do collect that personal information, what should you do about that? Now, I'm not going to go into the details here, but since NPM does record personal information, your name, job title, department, email address, I mean, it's not seriously sensitive data, but it is personal information and it is covered by these laws. And so you need to make sure that your corporate policies allows you to gather and process that data. You should review your IT policies. So for example, you're going to monitor someone, what they do on that device. Now, most companies already have IT policies in place that says if you use a device for work purposes, then the company reserves the right to monitor what's happening on that device. But make sure that your IT policy says that you're allowed to do that, even if the person is working from home. Then, very important from a legal perspective, you must inform your users that you are monitoring them, that you are gathering data, and you need to tell them what data it is that you're monitoring. And that previous slide essentially tells you what we are monitoring. But you also need to tell them how you're going to use that data. And of course, you need to stick to that promise. And we'll talk about your intent for that data. But the intent might be to help avoid burnout or to help fostering better productivity habits, etc. Now, by the way, some of these legal requirements can get quite interesting. But what we found from our existing customers is very often they've got a legal department or an HR department that have seen these types of requests before, and they can easily guide us in terms of what to do. And of course, we at Netsurit, we have seen many of these things, and so we can also quite easily advise you about, given your company's requirements and depending on which laws you need to conform with, we can definitely assist you in terms of figuring out what the right thing is to do there. So if you look at some of our competitors, some of our competitors do some horrible things, recording screenshots, keyboard locking, location tracking. Man, they do some horrible things there, like they monitor whatever application you're using. Some of them even use your webcam to see whether you're in front of the PC, and then they use facial recognition. They even do emotional recognition, where you can see this person was upset when he read that email from the CEO. Some really scary stuff. The point is that these things could be useful if you're doing a criminal investigation, forensic evidence gathering. But you don't need this if you're going to monitor for productivity. If you monitor for productivity, you pretty much only need this. You don't need these other things. So it really depends on what you're trying to monitor for. So it's really important to be ethical, right? So when you choose to monitor, or if you choose to monitor people, you need to do a little bit of thinking about who you monitor. And what we found is that it's really important to remember that you shouldn't only monitor those people that you suspect is not working enough, because it tends to create a negative culture. People start to doubt for what purpose you're doing this. The moment you're monitoring someone, are you really trying to help me to avoid burnout, or is there more a nefarious or a darker intent there? So don't monitor just based on past performance. In today's political sensitive atmosphere, it's also very important not to only monitor people based on certain groups like religion, ethnicity, gender, etc. Just don't do that. You'll get into some trouble somewhere that you would rather avoid. Our recommendation is that you monitor as large a population of your company as you can. That way you'll get more complete trends, better statistics, and have a fairer basis of comparison in terms of what is normal. So always look at the bigger picture. Don't just focus on one or two things in isolation. Consider the person's role. Not everyone has the same job. So to expect that everyone should work 6 hours a day in a business application or whatever it might be, it's important. A salesperson is not going to spend the same amount of time in front of their computer as, let's say, a developer. Also consider that not everyone has the same working hours, or they might not even work in the same time zone. Now, NPM kind of helps us to align these time zones. So I can, if somebody works in Canada and the next person works in Dubai, I can, normalize their time zone so that I can side by side compare what it is they do. But it's important to note that when you work with that. And of course, it's really important to get people's feedback. So don't just monitor them and afterwards tell them this is what we found. Share with them what you found and give them the opportunity to look at this, interpret the data for themselves. And they might then even be able to tell you, well, this is why I'm having that bad behavior. And maybe we should change this process or change the structure. And since the intent really should be to improve productivity, the real insights, sure, our tool might provide some insights, but the real insights is very often gotten to when you have a conversation with the people that you're monitoring, and they can then tell you why they're behaving the way that they do and how one could possibly fix that situation. So, of course, when you record some of this data, the more sensitive that data that you gather, the higher the security risk is, right? So if you choose to use software that collects screenshots, keyboard logging, etc., man, then you need to be very careful as to who has access to that data, where the data is stored, etc., etc. And so make sure that if you do go down the route of monitoring for productivity, that you carefully think about who has access. I'd also like to point out that there is something called a Hawthorne effect. Sometimes this is also known as the observer effect. And that's the fact that the moment you observe something, you also change that something. And it's a well-documented scientific behavior or human behavior. If you observe someone and if they know that they're being observed, they change their behavior. And the way in which they change the behavior is very often aligned to your intentions. If you're going to monitor for productivity, you need to figure out, are you going to approach this from a positive perspective or a negative perspective? If you're positive, your goals are typically to improve productivity, help to improve the culture, and have data so that you can take better informed decisions. But you can also go to the stick end of this thing and start to micromanage people, police people, or maybe you've already made up your mind as to what you want to do and you just need some data to justify your actions and belief. But if you approach things from a negative perspective, you typically end up with a workforce where there's a lot of fear, anger, resentment, and even sabotage we've seen. If you approach this from a positive perspective, that's when you actually build trust, cooperation between people, improving productivity, and in general growth. Now, given that, I'd like to tell you about some pitfalls, mistakes that we have seen people make with this, not just with our software, but actually mostly when people use other software and then later on migrate over to ours. We definitely advise against the following things. So don't combine productivity monitoring with forensic evidence gathering, because for forensic evidence gathering, in criminal situations, for that you need to gather a lot of data. It can be very sensitive, but you don't want to do that with everyone. You want to do that with the one or two people that you really strongly suspect is doing bad things. Don't combine it with timesheets, because that's very labor intensive and you don't want to place unnecessary burdens on people. And also don't combine this with security tools, because again, those can be very resource intensive. We also advise that you don't require sheet every time they went to have a cup of coffee. That's going to really upset most of your staff. Also, never monitor people without letting them know, without their consent. From a legal perspective, that's bad, but it's also bad from a trust perspective. We also recommend that you never use productivity monitoring data to discipline users, to decide who gets promoted or who gets retrenched. Because the moment you use that data for that, their behavior is going to change and you're going to end up with a relatively toxic culture. Also, always make sure that you interpret the data correctly. And so when you look at that report, you need to make sure that you understand what data it is really showing you. Also, don't look at the monitoring results too often. Because if you look at this data like every couple of hours or even once a day, and you discuss it with people once a day, that's going to make them feel like you're trying to micromanage them or police them. And that causes stress. So instead of solving the stress problem, you might be contributing to the stress problem. And again, don't only monitor some of your users based on seniority or gender or race or roles or anything like that. Rather, do it with as many people as you can so that you don't run into those problems. So in short, how are we different from other monitoring systems? And so there are many other types of applications that does this. The first thing is most of these other applications requires some user interaction, right? So you need to train users to clock in and capture this data and capture that data. That again adds a lot of overhead on the people. With us, no user action is necessary. There's nothing to remember. Of course, these other systems very often captures very intrusive data that most people don't like it to do. And that's very vulnerable to misuse. And of course, users don't like this. It creates a trust and culture issue. With us, the data that we gather is very low risk data. There's nothing really sensitive to misuse other than a person's email address, which is on most business cards. You also want to avoid manual interpretation work, right? So consider screenshots, for example. Who's going to look at those screenshots? All million of them captured per month. It's just not realistic. It requires a lot of manual interpretation work. With us, everything is automatically classified and interpreted, so there's nothing manual to do there. And of course, the insights, the reports that these tools provide, most tools out there, they're very easy to interpret for technical people. We focus on reports that are easy to interpret for business people. It's done. Our solution, we provide a 30-day free trial. We charge $4 per user per month. And that includes our software, which includes the agent, it includes the data extraction from Office 365, it includes emailing who you configured to receive those reports, to get email PDF reports. It includes the Power BI report. Although we just provide you with a Power BI report, you still have to host it in your own Office 365 environment, and for that you may need your own Power BI licenses. And of course, that price including hosting your NPM instance, your server environment in our Azure, it's included in the price. But the price excludes the deployment of that agent to people's computers. Your IT department may need to do that. Or of course, you can ask us to help you to do that, but that's not included in the price. It excludes the customization of the Power BI report, although you can do that if you've got the skills. It excludes the publishing and sharing of that Power BI report. As I've said, that you may need your own Power BI licensing to do that. And it is also possible with our new solution that you can run your NPM instance in your own Azure environment, so that all of the data extraction, the data analysis, and pretty much everything happens in your Azure environment, not ours. And that means we have no access to that. We would have literally just a list of users that you monitor on a monthly basis. That's the only information we would have. But it means that you have complete control over that. Now, if you choose to do that, you would then be responsible for the Azure costs, which for a 500-person company is about maybe $300 a month. So it's not terribly expensive, but we don't offer you a discount if you do that. So the pricing is relatively flexible. As you monitor more people, you pay more. As you monitor few people, you'll pay less. And we offer volume discounts for 1,000 users or more. And that brings us to the Q&A section. That was pretty much an hour. It's 1 hour later. As you've seen, it's a lot of content to go through. I was only able to fit this much into the hour, but I'm sure that many of you may have a lot more questions around your specific requirements. And that's, of course, why we have the Q&A section, but also feel free afterwards to ask questions, to mail either Amy or myself and ask specific questions. If you'd like to get an in-person demo about what our software looks like and actually go into the details of what it does, how it works, some of the interesting technical things around that, please let us know. And I think, yeah, I'm going to stop sharing this, and then maybe we can go into the Q&A section. Amy, back to you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Louis. That was great. More information in there this time than last time that I heard it. So